Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war, I guess a geopolitics update. We're going to go into some of the fallout from the Alaska summit again. It's like the third time I've discussed this, but actually more is coming out through mainstream media. There are more revelations, such as this first one, that 8 pages were left on a printer in a hotel that were pretty sensitive documents left by the Americans, and this was it is pretty embarrassing for the Americans. It's a bit of a faux pas there. It has shown a number of things. First of all, that they're calling Vladimir Putin His Excellency, a luncheon in honor of His Excellency Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation. I mean, the Americans are they're forgetting that he's an indicted war criminal. They're forgetting that he is a murderous dictator. Now he's His Excellency, and this is all in his honor. You know, the red carpet's rolled out. I mean, it's just horrible. But this is, I think, extra embarrassing. And it turns out that from these same documents, we understand that Trump was going to give him a gift at this luncheon. Now, the luncheon ended up being cancelled, which is in itself very interesting. I'm trying to work out exactly what went on to leave all the aides of Trump, and by aides I mean, you know, people like Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio, Caroline Leavitt, ashen-faced and wide-eyed and looking like they were frightened or horrified or what, as they were coming out in and out of this meeting. And so something happened. When you look at Trump's body language at the beginning of the meeting, he was all smiling. At the end, he was drawn, haggard, tired, which may be in a physical thing. Obviously, you know, it was late. Putin didn't get there till 9 o'clock. This was all, I think, a ruse from Putin. He completely dominated the proceedings. He owned it. He won it. All of the previous analysis that I've given completely still holds. It's just, it seems worse than even that now, as it turns out that the Americans were lining up to give Putin this kind of adulation or whatever, and it didn't happen. So, you know, what really took place in that meeting? Now, I think that Trump probably does believe it's a 10 out of 10 meeting, but others around him probably didn't. And Trump's lack of understanding of geopolitics and lack of knowledge of Russia and Ukraine probably gave him this. I mean, he has a fallacy of invincibility anyway, this idea that he's always winning wherever he goes and whatever he does. But other people around him are probably like, no, that sucked. And the whole thing was an absolute disaster. And isn't it interesting that we haven't heard from Marco Rubio? We haven't heard from Steve Witkoff. We haven't heard from Caroline Leavitt, as far as I'm aware. You know, it's been a few days. Trump went and played golf the next day. He literally went back to the US and played golf. He's now played golf for, 50 days of his tenure so far. It's an absolute disgrace. An absolute disgrace that American taxpayers are paying for that. Paying for a $200 million golden ballroom appended to the White House. But apparently there's homelessness and crime that needs to be fixed in Washington, D.C. to the point where you're going to send the National Guard. Well, I'll tell you what, $200 million would solve that, rather than build a bloody ballroom. I mean, the whole presidency is an absolute mess. It's just a hot mess. And you may argue differently, but bring it on. Bring it on. I will argue till I'm blue in the face that this presidency is an absolute hot mess. Now, it turns out that Reuters has got hold of the outline, and take it with a pinch of salt though, the outline of Putin's offer to end the war in Ukraine that Trump was regurgitating. And the offer is no ceasefire before a full deal, exactly the opposite of what Ukraine have been asking for. Ukraine is out of Donetsk and Luhansk, so they get out of both of the entirety of those, and then Russia returns parts of Sumy and Kharkiv, which is what we thought before. So at the top of Ukraine, where Russia have come down in a couple of tiny places, Russia gives that back to Ukraine, but in return gets to keep the entirety of Donetsk, gets to have all of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast that they don't presently control. It's a massive mismatch. And the lines are frozen in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Absolutely incredible. Crimea is recognized formally as Russian. Partial sanctions relief, so lifting sanctions on, I don't know what, aviation industry, X, Y, Z. No NATO for Ukraine, so Ukraine is forbidden from joining NATO. And Russian language and church protections are to be instituted. So Russian is to be put on a par with Ukrainian as a language. Wow. And that's what Trump ended up proposing to Ukraine, it appears. And then Reuters also says after talks with Trump, Putin signed a decree that could allow foreign investors, including a leading American oil company, to return to the Sakhalin-1 project. This is, I talked about this previously, that, I think it was ExxonMobil get to go back and make huge amounts of spondoolies out of being in Russia. It's just like, yeah, business as usual. Yeah, forget about the fact that you're a murderous dictator. We're rolling out the red carpet. Our soldiers are going to be on their knees rolling out this red carpet for you. You get down off the plane and you get to speak first. You get to speak for 3 times as long. You get a gift. You get to be called Your Excellency. You just own the whole thing. I mean, as Call to Activism says, we're going to talk about this part or nah? Luncheon in honor of His Excellency Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation. And that's kind of how it went. So Steve Rosenberg, who is in Moscow dealing with the Russian media on a daily basis, he says they're cock-a-hoop about this. The Russian media, as I've already reported, see this as a massive, massive win. And this is what they're saying in the newspapers. A tactical victory for Russian diplomacy. Huge diplomatic victory for Vladimir Putin. Trump perceived Russia's interests as legitimate. They're loving it. And you can go and see more of that by watching Steve Rosenberg's whole video on that, his YouTube video that he does every day. They are absolutely loving it. Let's just pop into the beginning of it, shall we?
Judging by what the Russian newspapers have been saying on their websites, Moscow perceives the Alaska summit as a victory for the Kremlin, believing that President Trump has moved closer to the Kremlin's position on the war in Ukraine. Moskovsky Komsomolets writes, shortly after parting ways with Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump said it was determined by all that the best way to end the horrific war between Russia and Ukraine is to go directly to a peace agreement, which would end the war, and not a mere ceasefire agreement, which oftentimes do not hold up. Trump himself came to this conclusion following his conversation with the Russian president, and this is an obvious tactical victory for Russian diplomacy. According to some reports, Russia is demanding that Ukraine withdraw from parts of the Donbass that are still under Ukrainian control. And if there is no peace agreement, the Russian leadership, I suspect, will not be too upset. Putin has been banking on, and continues to bank on, the Russian army, on its ability to force the Ukrainian army into a corner, and by doing so, force Kiev to adopt a slightly different negotiating position. Komsomolskaya Pravda, too, sees the Alaska summit as a diplomatic win for the Kremlin. It's becoming clear that Vladimir Putin needed a personal meeting with Trump so that Russia wouldn't fall into the main diplomatic trap. Europe and Ukraine have bet everything on one card. A ceasefire doesn't benefit Russia, so we will demand a ceasefire with all our might, and every time Moscow refuses, we will shout that Putin wants the war to continue. Face to face, Putin has smashed these myths, diligently nurtured by Britain, the European Union and Kiev. He explained to Trump, Russia is for peace, but a ceasefire is categorically disadvantageous to us, because in this case we lose all the advantage on the front line. So let's immediately discuss a peace agreement, skipping the ceasefire stage. In the meantime, Russia will resolve its problems, first and foremost, on the front line. And this is another huge diplomatic victory for Vladimir Putin. Our soldiers have the opportunity to calmly liberate one or even several settlements a day, while Europe and Ukraine resist peace.
And there you have it. I mean, convincing. So Trump before the summit was ceasefire. There has to be a ceasefire. If there's not going to be a ceasefire, I'm going to give severe consequences to Russia and put sanctions on like you've never seen before. And he comes out saying, yeah, it's not going to be a ceasefire. No, and they're not going to have sanctions. So Russia completely won this. And it's very clear there that this allows them to keep taking territory. this is a military victory as much as a diplomatic victory for Russia, at least as far as they see it. And the fact that Trump allowed that, I think, is absolutely disgusting. And that is one of the big losses out of this, and not only all the other things we talked about previously, the normalization of relationships with this monster, X, Y, and Z, but it's that a ceasefire didn't happen, and that Trump no longer sees the value of the ceasefire, although he doesn't realize it. The rationale for his value is that they oftentimes don't work. Yeah, because they're not upheld by Russia, right? Ceasefires aren't good, so I don't advocate it anymore, and that allows Russia to, as they would see it, continue winning on the battlefield. This is a military victory for Russia. Absolutely outrageous. So, continuing on, we have this. I just want to play you this because, I know it's getting a lot of purchase at the moment, but I tell you what, there shouldn't be anyone in America, but there'll be plenty of people, probably 45% of people, who will deny that Kamala Harris could ever be right. But my goodness, she was right in this debate with Trump. My goodness, she was right.
And it is absolutely well known that these dictators and autocrats are rooting for you to be president again because they're so clear they can manipulate you with flattery and favors.
They can manipulate you with flattery and favors. He comes out from that meeting and says, Vladimir Putin said how hot the country is, how well we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And he said that the election in 2020 was rigged and the Russia hoax and blah, blah, blah. Just manipulated Trump entirely and completely successfully. Now, the Nordic nations have brought out a statement after the summit saying, we see that Russia is rejecting numerous demands for a ceasefire, or Zelensky saying this, for a ceasefire, and has not yet determined when it will stop the killings. This complicates the situation. So the Baltic 8, they are going to be leaders of Nordic Baltic 8. So they are Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Iceland. So we remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine and to efforts, including by President Trump, to end the war of aggression against Ukraine. To achieve just and lasting peace, the next step must be together with Ukraine. Only Ukraine can make decisions concerning its future. No decisions on Ukraine without Ukraine, and no decisions on Europe without Europe. This is absolutely right, and this is exactly how the other European nations and indeed the UK formulated their statements. Experience has shown that Putin cannot be trusted. Ultimately, it is Russia's responsibility to end this blatant violations of international law. Russia's aggression and imperialist ambitions are the root causes of the war. So Trump and Putin appear to agree that they need to solve the root cause of the war. The root cause of the war are Russian imperialism. The root cause of the war is Putin. And here the joint statement of these nations states that. So achieving a just and lasting peace requires a ceasefire and credible security guarantees for Ukraine. A peace agreement needs firm and concrete commitments by transatlantic partners to safeguard Ukraine against any future aggression. We welcome President Trump's statement that the US is prepared to participate in security guarantees. No limitations should be placed on Ukraine's armed forces or on its cooperation with other countries. Russia has no veto over Ukraine's pathway to the EU and NATO. We demand that Russia urgently returns children who have been abducted from occupied territories, as well as prisoners of war and civilian prisoners. We will continue to arm Ukraine and enhance Europe's defences to deter further Russian aggression. As long as Russia continues its killing, we will continue to strengthen sanctions and wider economic measures to put pressure on Russia's war economy. We stand firm in our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. It's absolutely on point there from those nations. Then we hear the French Minister for European Affairs, Benjamin Haddad, said that Paris rejects the idea of Ukraine's demilitarization, stressing that strengthening its army is one of the key guarantees of security. He added that any peace agreement must include clear security guarantees for Ukraine, for Kyiv. And that's absolutely correct. So, so Benjamin Haddad, Minister... European Affairs, Minister for European Affairs, says Russia is a menace, is a lasting menace for Ukraine and for Europe, is a threat. And that's absolutely on point. So what you're getting is and some people have said there has been actually a success of the Alaska summit. Now, it might not be intentional. It might not be a success that was set out by Trump or indeed by Russia. But the success of the Alaska summit could potentially be the unification around Ukraine of Europe and the UK, EU, UK, Norway, all these nations getting together and saying, no, we are definitely in support of Ukraine. So actually it's solidifying support for Ukraine rather than breaking it apart. Well, actually what it's seeking to do from a Russian point of view is knock a wedge between the US and Europe. And that may have happened. That may end up happening. It depends on this meeting tomorrow between Zelensky and Trump. And that is where it's all going to come out in a wash. Now, we are going to talk about that at the end because it turns out that an absolute ton of people are going to be at that meeting, apparently. But here we have one source talking about the Wall Street Journal, which is otherwise would have been a pro-Trumpian Murdoch broadsheet, is now being more and more critical of Trump. And I find this very interesting. It could be underwritten by Trump's business acumen being absolutely down the pan. Tariffs and trade wars being very problematic for the US's economic outlook. And the Wall Street Journal's not going to like that. But the conservative Wall Street Journal editorial board just issued a scathing op-ed detailing how Trump failed to get any concessions from Putin while Putin managed to play Trump like a fiddle to get what he wanted. Quote, "It was notable that Mr. Putin spent most of his soliloquy in front of the press, flattering Mr. Trump." So soliloquy is a speech that you make on your own, although usually it's not a soliloquy. Actually, it was a speech to people rather than a speech to yourself. But anyway, endorsing the US president's view that the war would never have happened if Mr. Trump had been in office in 2022, and extolling the possibilities for US-Russia business ties. In that sense, the Russian achieved one of his major goals from the summit, which is the start of his rehabilitation as a world leader. The summit ended his isolation from the West, and he gave up nothing for it. He also appears to have gained more time to continue bombing Ukrainian cities and slowly taking more territory. It is clear what Mr. Trump gained. He had told the press that he would be angry if no ceasefire emerged from the parley, but Mr. Trump showed no peak afterwards. Sorry, it isn't clear what Trump gained. So Trump gained nothing apart from a photo op with Putin. Trump gained nothing, Ukraine gained nothing, Russia gained everything. And the Wall Street Journal is very aware of that. And as I mentioned, and I'm now, because actually it's behind a bit of a paywall on the Daily Mail, I'm not sure what that's about, but Boris Johnson wrote a piece as a former Prime Minister and big fan of Trump, wrote a piece that absolutely, as Tim White says, unleashes both barrels at Trump and Putin. Now, this is quite risky from Boris Johnson because you would think he's previously been very careful in how he speaks about Trump, even when Trump is being a wingnut. But I think he's given up on that now and is going both barrels. So the ex-UK Prime Minister in the Daily Mail describes Alaska as, quote, the most vomit-inducing episode. It made the gorge rise to see Putin welcomed onto American soil, emetic to see him applauded to the red carpet, nauseating to watch his Gollum-like smirk. So Boris Johnson was not evidently a fan of what took place. So the title was, it's the most vomit-inducing episode in all the tawdry history of international diplomacy, but it will have taught Trump this vital lesson. So we've already heard the opening. It was nauseating to watch his Gollum-like smirk as he became one of the only world leaders I can think of to be invited to ride in the back of the presidential limo. It was positively chunderous to hear him given an American platform for his lies about the causes of the war in Ukraine, a country that in 2014, when he first attacked it, posed no threat whatsoever to Russia. As I listened to the unctuous and wearisome predictability with which he tried to both flatter and discreetly humiliate Donald Trump, I wanted to gag. I bet you did too, and most of us are not even Ukrainian. Imagine how it felt to be one of those embattled heroes in a dugout near Pokrovsk fighting for your country's freedom, and to hear the President of the United States, the ex-officio team captain of the free world, refer to Vladimir Putin as the boss. Wretch. Think of the tens of thousands of Ukrainian widows and orphans. Think of the maimed and mutilated. Think of the Ukrainian civilians living in daily and nightly terror of Putin's bombs and missiles still raining down, even though the so-called negotiations were taking place in Alaska. I mean, this is Boris Johnson going to town on this. So let's continue. Ask yourself how those people felt to hear the US president, in some ways the world's ultimate guarantor of freedom and democracy, refer to the, quote, fantastic relationship he has with Putin, a dictator who has been torturing their country for 3.5 years. It was a disgusting moment because Putin is a war criminal whose continual lies, dissimulation and aggression are directly analogous to Hitler. Yet you sometimes hear the White House's objective is to stop the death or to stop the killing in Ukraine, as though there were faults on both sides. What rubbish. Honestly, like, Boris Johnson is going to town on the Trump administration's rationale, rhetoric, and actions. This is an absolute broadside. The blood of every Russian who has died in this conflict is on Putin's hands. The blood of every Ukrainian who has died is on Putin's hands. All the carnage and all the tragedy in Ukraine is the fault of one man, because right now there would be no war, there would be no bloodshed, there would be no disaster if there were not for the continuing arrogance, folly and fundamental miscalculation of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. That was why it was so hard to stomach the sight of Putin preening at the Alaska summit. That was why the event felt so objectionable. And yet, like so many of the most objectionable pieces of historic diplomacy, that meeting was also, of course, justifiable and even essential. Puke-making though it was, Trump was right to try. So this is where you get a little bit of, okay, let's try and be nice to Trump. Now, I talked about this yesterday. So, you know, if Kamala Harris or Biden had tried to have a meeting with Putin, or indeed if Europe took over from the US now and tried to sort out the war between Putin and Zelensky, Putin wouldn't agree to go and do that meeting. But the question then, and this is what Boris Johnson doesn't quite understand, the question is, well, why does Putin agree to meet with with Trump? And the answer is because Trump is manipulatable. And we've heard that from Kamala Harris. We know that. Tim Cook manipulated him with a bit of gold to give concessions, tariff concessions to Apple. All you need to do is bribe him with either fawning rhetoric or bits of gold, or both. And Putin did this and knew this and was able to. That's why he went to have the meeting with Trump. So the idea that Trump should try to have this meeting, well, yeah, I suppose, diplomacy is always kind of good, but actually there is a time and a place for it, and it's probably not now. What you want to do is make sure that Ukraine is in the ascendancy and the nail is being driven into the coffin of Russia. That's when you have the diplomacy and you force him to the table. If he's willingly coming to the table, it's because it will be to the advantage of Vladimir Putin. So I disagree with Boris Johnson's attempt to kind of be nice to Trump here. Well, he had to try. It was essentially tried. No. You force him to the table. You don't allow him to come to the table on his terms in your country, in a military base in Alaska, and dictate the entire meeting. No. He was right to try. I don't think so. He was right to meet Putin. I don't think so. Because if millions of Ukrainians are watching with horror at the red carpet rehabilitation of a Russian tyrant, they were also watching with hope. Yeah, but that's false hope. If it's on his terms, no, there is no hope. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. My opinion is borne out by actually what happened. Should this meeting have happened, given where we are now? No, it shouldn't. So therefore, Trump was wrong to do what he did. End of. They were hoping that maybe, just maybe, and again, you don't have a meeting on just maybes. If just maybe is like a 10% chance, but 90% chance it goes tits up, right? Then you're actually having a meeting, and you're having a meeting knowing that 90% chance it's all going to go wrong. Well, don't have the meeting then. You are not justified. So when it says back here, actually, I could be all philosophical about this, but it's like in epistemology, in the theory of truth and knowledge. Like, you don't go through life on a 10% probability for truth, right? You don't go, well, I think that's true, even though it's justified by a 10% probability. Well, no, you think you think the opposite. It's unlikely it's true. It's far more likely it's untrue. I mean, you don't cross the road thinking, well, I hope I'm going to survive. I've got a 10% chance of surviving if I cross the road with my eyes closed. Well, don't cross the road with your eyes closed, you idiot. Like, if you've got a 90% chance of dying, getting run over, don't fricking do it. So if you've got a 90% chance of this going wrong and only 10% hope, then you're not justified in having this meeting. I mean, that is really philosophically problematic, what Boris Johnson is saying here. I mean, I haven't read this. Just read the very beginning. But this is, fascinating. So this is him trying to be nice to Trump, but actually having an unjustifiable argument in his desire to try and be a bit nicer to Trump in the middle. They were hoping that just maybe, the fabled New York deal maker could produce a solution that would end the war, but still salvage what they want and need, namely the freedom, sovereignty, and independence of their country. Again, it wasn't worth it. Probability wasn't in their favor. Donald Trump was and is right to take the risk because he knows that one day Putin will indeed make a deal. His position in Moscow is far weaker than it appears. Yeah, it is, but you've now given him more power. His strength in Moscow has now been enriched. The Russian economy is starting to creak under the burden of war. Unemployment is climbing, and so are inflation and interest rates. Putin has seen one of the biggest oil customers, India, suddenly and unexpectedly hit by Trump's secondary sanctions, with Bloomberg reporting signs that Indian buyers of hydrocarbons are already switching away from Russia. Most important of all, Putin still cannot and will not crush the spirit of the Ukrainian resistance. Yes, times are very tough for Ukrainian fighters, and yes, with titanic effort and expense, Putin has managed to make some small gains in the east, theatrically designed to coincide with the Alaska summit. But those advances have again been constrained by the Ukrainians, and as of now, mid-August, the much vaunted vast Russian summer offensive of 2025 has yet to materialize, let alone succeed. Trump has been 100% right to sense a chance for peace. No, he hasn't. And right to want to make peace. Well, yeah. He is one of those who thinks, with Benjamin Franklin, that there never was a good war or a bad peace. And he is right there too. There can be bad peace. That's what he wants when he says, I'd rather have a quick negotiation than a ceasefire. He wants a quick peace, and a quick peace is a bad peace. But it was clear to observers of this summit, and I believe it was pretty clear to the American negotiators in the room, that Putin does not want peace, certainly not on terms that either the US or Ukraine could accept. Anyone who has worked with Trump and knows his moods could tell that this meeting was not a success. The advertised lunch did not take place. There was none of the predicted discussion of any mouth-watering new commercial partnership between the US and Russia or Arctic collaboration. Instead, the summit ended abruptly and several hours prematurely with an extremely vacuous press conference at which Trump extraordinarily did not take questions from the press. This meeting was only valuable in this sense that in Alaska, Trump came face-to-face with the reality. So this is where he's right. So okay. He shouldn't need to go to the trouble of meeting and normalizing and propping up Putin to realize that Putin's not interested in peace. So the success of this, according to Boris Johnson, is that Trump has learnt a lesson. But that's to accept that Trump is too thick to have learnt that lesson without having done that. That Trump is so deluded that he didn't know that previously. All of us knew that. All of us knew that Putin wasn't interested in peace. So the success of this is that Trump finally realizes that. The success of this is Trump finally realizes that he's a bit dim. Well done. But then it is good. It's good that he does recognize this. It's just frustrating that he didn't recognize it before because he's freaking clueless. The meeting was only valuable in this sense that in Alaska, Trump came face to face with the reality. Putin fundamentally wants to control Ukraine and make it once again a vassal state of Moscow. The Ukrainians fundamentally want to be free, and in that desire they can have long-term support for whether Western democracies and crucially of Trump himself, and indeed of Melania Trump, the First Lady, who is playing an increasing role in shaping her husband's thinking. Trump, the realtor, the real estate agent, has discovered, or real estate magnate, has discovered that this isn't about real estate. This isn't about geography or territory. This is about destiny. And he finishes, it's about the right of Ukrainians to choose their own destiny as a free and independent European nation. That means the war won't end until Putin accepts the truth, that he has lost the battle for the destiny of Ukraine. It's only when that happens, when Putin accepts a spiritual truth that is obvious to anyone who visits Ukraine, that we will have peace. Frankly, I doubt that Donald Trump will much enjoy the global headlines today. I don't think he will enjoy the idea that Putin has bested him, that Trump rolled out the red carpet for a pariah and expended a lot of political capital and got nothing in return. The failure of Alaska will harden what I believe is his growing conviction that the only way to fix this is now to intensify the pressure on Putin. Nobody really expected the US president to go ahead and put secondary sanctions on countries that have continued to buy Russian oil and gas, and yet he did it. What about Britain? What about Europe? What are we going to have to when are we going to have the courage to do the same? This is our continent. We continue to demand leadership from America, and yet when we get that leadership, we don't even have the guts to follow suit. One day this war will end with a peace that protects Ukrainian freedom, but as Trump said in Alaska, the Europeans led by Britain will have to step up. So I agree with broadly like 80% of this, but there's 20% that has my head in my hands. But Boris Johnson goes to town on Trump, and I hope that he gets to read this. I hope. The problem is he has these guys around him. Is Will Schaff, who gives him all of the media excerpts, gives that to Trump. And unless Trump sees it, turns over the TV and watches CNN or MSNBC, he's not going to see this. Trump will not see what Boris Johnson has written about Trump unless he is handed it by his aides. His aides will not do that to protect him. But this is an absolutely devastating article by Boris Johnson. It really, really is. And I'm glad I read it to you in full. Now, Anna, I'm not going to read this, but Anna Applebaum, The Atlantic here, takes an excerpt from an article that says Trump has no cards. Why would Putin need to make a deal with him? Quote, the better way to understand anchorage is not as the start of something new, but as a continuation of a longer process. And this is kind of what Rory Stewart was saying in my video that I did yesterday. As the US dismantles its foreign policy tools, as this administration fires the people who know how to use them, our ability in the US to act with any agility will diminish. And then we have Andrew Perpetua. Putin is conceding terms in negotiation in large part because the Russian economy is severely hurting. Military signing bonuses are being dramatically reduced due to budget shortfalls. Companies are going out of business left and right. Inflation is nasty, and China is manipulating Russian markets to damage Russian industries. Soon, Russia will need to increase their shadow mobilization to make up for the volunteers lost as signing incentives shrink. Shocking. Both public perception of the war and the economy all over again. Russia is in serious danger, and nobody should be bailing out Putin now. This is the time to tighten the screws and watch him squirm. Everything is unfolding exactly how the actually good economists have been predicting for the past 2 years. Trump's election and his immediate relief to Putin helped Russia substantially, and Trump is the sort of stupid who would fall for Putin's tricks. But Russia is racing against time. We should use that time against him and them, and not allow them to wriggle out now while they superficially appear strong. A lesson straight from the Russo-Japanese War. For years, we said that eventually Putin will realise he has run out of options and sue for peace. The correct response is simple. Wait 6 months and get back to him. That is a direct contradiction of what Boris Johnson just said in a way that I criticised Johnson, which is you force Putin to the table. You don't bring him to the table because you think it's necessary to have these peace negotiations now. Boris Johnson got that wrong. Trump got that very, very wrong. Andrew Perpetua and myself, I would say, are right, and I think we're borne out by what took place in Alaska just now. Now, go and watch Jake Bro. Jake Bro has a whole section on how Putin used body doubles, and a body double was at Alaska, and it could explain why kind of Lavrov was the key person, and possibly in the talks, and why America was angry. I don't know. There's lots to talk about with regard to that. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too much, other than to say there is an interesting Wikipedia article, alleged doubles of Vladimir Putin. It is well worth reading. It gives you a good synopsis of everything. And then gets down on the analysis to say, well, first of all, a Russian-Latvian independent media outlet, Medusa, did using Amazon recognition, a neural network of face recognition, showed that the similarity of body doubles is from 99.6 to 99.9%, which contradicts the conspiracy theory. However, Then other analysis has shown the complete opposite. In June 2023, Japanese researchers in the field of facial recognition and voice identification concluded that Putin probably had at least one body double. Putin's participation in the 2023 Moscow Victory Day parade was chosen as a baseline comparison. When analysing facial features, the researchers found that the president, who drove a Mercedes car across the Crimean Bridge in December 2022, matched Putin at the parade by only 53%, while the latter's resemblance to Putin, who visited Mariupol in March 2023, was 40%. So you've got like a three-way analysis going on with three different doubles. So it looks like there's at least a single body double, possibly two. An analysis of the word thank you from Putin's speech at the Eurasian Economic Forum in May 2023 reveals strong differences in the pronunciation of some words, highlighting potential differences in the president's voice at different events. Then there have also been claims that he has been at two events at the same time, reported in the press, and it's impossible. So there has to be a double doing that. Anyway, so on and so forth. There's lots to this. You can go and see various articles. Newsweek has an article. The Sun had a really, actually quite good article on this. Putin body double claims analysed by facial recognition experts, what we've just been talking about. This goes back to a meme that a Russian journalist put out some time ago, some years back. And there are, if you go back to the Wikipedia page, it talks about there being, I will talk about this actually here. In the 2010s, a meme with a table of the original Putin and 6 of his body doubles, Babler, Udmurt, Banquet, Kuchma, Bruise and Diplomat, with photos and descriptions of each, became popular. According to the meme, each of the body doubles performs certain duties or has a distinguishing feature. For example, Babler is deployed for direct line shows. Diplomat participates in negotiations, so maybe it's Diplomat, there's the Alaska. Banquet is used for interviews, handshakes and photos with the public. Kuchma is characterized by a record-breaking chubby chin. And Udmurt is basically the worst double ever, used when Babler needs a vacation. On the 5th of September 2016, Russian journalist Oleg Kashin posted a meme on his Facebook page, making it more popular. And this is the one. So you've got, and there is no doubt, you look at the top Putin, and that top Putin is looking very different from all these other Putins. That's for sure. And when you look back at the 90s, at the Putin that used to, the KGB Putin, in the early days of, when he's St. Petersburg mayor and then became president and prime minister, he does look very different from the modern Putin, I would say. So yeah, you can imagine that Putin down there looks more like that Putin than some of these ones in the middle. And there is an analysis of the chin and so on and so forth. Anyway, you can go and check that out at your own leisure. But Jake Brode has a really good section of his video on that and how that might pertain to the outcome of the Alaska summit. Right, then we're going to go to here. So as mentioned by a number of people, it all felt wrong in the press gaggle that was around in the press room, as they were witnessing people going in and out, people with ashen faces, wide-eyed. People did not look happy, and even Fox News were reporting live that it looks like Trump got steamrolled, and it did not feel good in the room. Nothing felt good in the room, and really critical analyses. Anyway, this Daily Beast article is pretty decent. MSNBC host says Caroline Leavitt looked ashen after the Putin meeting, which I've already played. I didn't play you the host bit. I played you the MSNBC reporter talking about that informs the host. The MSNBC host Antonia Hilton has suggested that President Donald Trump's aides, particularly Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, may have been, quote, frightened by what they had witnessed during the president's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. On Saturday night's episode of MSNBC's The Weekend Primetime, Hilton spoke to former US Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. So Michael McFaul is a very good, knowledgeable person on these matters, obviously as a former ambassador. And an Obama appointee about Trump's summit with Putin in Anchorage on Friday. Quote, a lot of the press corps that was there, they reported on in the minutes and hours after the presser that they saw members of the administration, like Caroline Leavitt, look ashen, almost frightened after what they'd seen behind closed doors. What did that indicate to you? Hilton asked McFaul. McFaul responded, we should all be glad that we did not go to Alaska because I was in Helsinki with you. So the Helsinki presser, where Trump got absolutely, I'd say, properly steamrolled, definitely by Putin, came out and regurgitated Putin's talking points on Russian interference in American elections and went over the heads of he contradicted his own intelligence in favor of a former KGB agent, whilst only talking to him alone in a room with no one but a Russian translator. So McFaul says, and I was in Geneva when President Biden met. They travelled a long way for nothing in return, those journalists. He continued, but that suggests to me that this was a bigger disaster than they're letting on. To your point, they're trying to spin it, although they're not even trying to spin it. That's a really interesting thing. And that's what I said. Why have you not heard from Caroline Leavitt, Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio? They're not even trying to spin it. They're absent. I think that shows this was a disaster, and I agree with Michael McFaul here. When I worked at the White House and we would have meetings like this, I was the SAO, the senior administration official, and would call up journalists that would call the New York Times to say, this is what was discussed, to push it this way. They're not even attempting to do that because they know they don't have anything to work with. So journalists aren't even being called by the White House to kind of prompt in certain directions how successful this was. The Daily Beast has reached out to the White House for comment. Summit in Alaska was largely considered a failure as a highly anticipated peace deal between Russia and Ukraine failed to materialise. After a significant amount of pomp and circumstance that included a literal red carpet and 3 hours of talks, Trump told reporters, we didn't get there, but we did have a very good chance of getting there. But we have a very good chance of getting there. There's no deal until there's a deal, Trump said. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people and I think are appropriate, and I'll of course call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. Prior to the summit, Leavitt was on the defensive, taking aim at naysayers who dared to criticise Trump. Appearing on Fox and Friends on Thursday morning, Leavitt said of the president's critics, quote, I think it's pathetic that some of the chatter that we see from those so-called experts who have zero accomplishments on their resumes to point to. President Trump knows what he's doing. And then, of course, she's then looking ashen-faced and wide-eyed and possibly realising that he doesn't have a clue what he's doing and that it was completely owned by people like Lavrov. Michael Weiss says, as the ignominy of Alaska recedes, though, don't lose sight of what Putin alluded to at the presser as the biggest fear, Europe uniting around Ukraine. So this is what I was talking about earlier, and putting enormous pressure on Trump to reject the Russian demands. We're going to come to this now. Possibly by offering their own incentives for doing so. The EU is our largest trading partner. Russia's GDP is smaller than California's. Russia's oil and gas are commodities. Even his president has said he wants less foreign dependency on. Just ask the Indians. Moreover, GOP opinion, Republican opinion, is shifting favourably on Ukraine, likely because Kiev has played along with Trump's reindeer games for 6 long months while Russia's continued to terrorise Ukrainian cities, something Trump himself has highlighted, and abduct his children, something his wife is evidently exercised by. Fox News was rightly embarrassed by the spectacle in Anchorage, and now conservative media are more or less characterising their man as a pathetic chump. Residentures in the US won't have failed to cable back to Moscow that Trump is nicknamed taco for a reason. Right, okay, that's a taco emoji. So this is, everyone, even Fox News, Fox News are not jubilant about what happened, are they? So this is across the board a disaster. Now, the question is what happens next? Well, does Zelensky agree to Russia's proposals as spoken through the mouthpiece of the Kremlin, Donald Trump? So Donald Trump has regurgitated the Russian talking points and proposals. Zelensky cannot sign up to them. But he, like I said yesterday, he needs other people around him. His English isn't good enough to manipulate Trump, right? And to persuade Trump. He needs other people around it. It turns out that freaking everyone is going, right? So Tim White says, also making a trip is Ursula von der Leyen for EU Commission President. She's revealed that herself, not invited by the White House. It will be interesting to see Trump's reactions, as I suspect he has less sympathy with Ms. von der Leyen. But the EU needs and has a right to be represented. This afternoon, I will welcome Zelensky to Brussels. So he's in Brussels now as we speak. Together, we will participate in the coalition of the willing. The request of Zelensky, I will join the meeting with President Trump and other European leaders in the White House tomorrow. Now, I'm not sure Trump's going to agree to this, but at the moment we have Ursula von der Leyen, Zelensky, and then we have German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni going. Then apparently Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going, according to Bild, and French President Emmanuel Macron. We have NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte will also attend the meeting. And then we have Finnish President Stubb is also going to Washington on Monday with Zelensky. Now, he's a bit, along with Mark Rutte, a bit of a Trump whisperer. He plays golf and has played golf with Trump, and I think that's a way into Trump. But my goodness, it turns out that now we've got all these people going, and I think that's going to be overkill. So Trump, that will be too confrontational. So I don't know how they're going to play this, but it's really freaking important because it all rests on this meeting. That was a disaster in Alaska. Do you salvage this and then have Trump together with these people form a united front against Russia? If that happens, then Alaska becomes a success because it was a disaster. The success of Alaska is the fact that it was such a disaster that Trump, as Boris Johnson said, realizes he had made a mistake. I mean, like I said earlier, he's too stupid to have realized that before, unfortunately, but it took something like Alaska being a disaster to bring him to a realization. Now, the question is, which way does he go? Does he double down on his intuitions to be behind a dictator because he's of his own authoritarian bent? Or does he then realize that actually Europe is right and Ukraine is right and sides with these people? And that's where we're at now. Now, I'm going to leave you with this. This is Brian Glenn, an American scare quotes journalist. He is the boyfriend of Marjorie Taylor Greene. And he is a guy that asked Zelensky why he wasn't wearing a jacket in the White House. It was his question. So, American journalist Brian Glenn, who asked a provocative question about the jacket during a visit to Zelensky in the White House Oval Office in February, has received... Oh, what's he received here?
No bribes. No bribes. Just vodka. No.
Has received a bottle of vodka from a Russian journalist as a token of thanks. And then says, no bribes, no bribes. Vodka. Just vodka. No, that literally is a bribe. The gift was given to him by a Russian journalist during the summit held in Alaska. And there you go. There you go. That's the modern MAGA GOP. Not the whole of the GOP. Not your Reagan Republicans. I met two Reagan Republicans from Illinois when I was on holiday. And they were so anti-Trump. Yet she had campaigned for Reagan. I mean, they were pretty old. They were late 70s, I would say. He was a former veteran, then went into dairy business. Really lovely people. They were in an apartment next to us, and they had a 16-year-old grandson, and we hooked them up with our boys, and he had a final 2 days that were really great. So I'm really happy that happened. And then we were speaking, we went and had a meal with these guys, and fascinating talking to them, just how they feel politically homeless. They are like, I was talking a bit about Ukraine, but talking a lot about just the American political system, what's going on. And they were in agreement with like 95% of what I said. Like you otherwise would have thought they were Democrats, except they weren't. They were clearly Republicans. But they were absolutely anti-Trump. They were like, what is he doing to our country? And that gave me hope. But, what we want is young Republicans to think that as well. What we want are activists, present Republican activists and lawmakers to stand up for old school conservative values. Now, I'm not an old school conservative. Like, I don't particularly think those values are then aligned with me, but I'd much prefer that to MAGA republicanism. And this is what you get with MAGA republicanism, people ambushing Zelensky in the White House and then getting given gifts of vodka by Russian journalists and accepting that. I'd not accept. I mean, that's bad. But that is the modern GOP from a MAGA point of view. That's enough from me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.